Greetings, friends. My name is Pavel Stelmach, and now we will dive into the top news of this day. The European Union is deploying the civil protection mechanism to assist Ukraine after Russia blew up the Kakhovka HPP. Ukraine needs international support, humanitarian, diplomatic, and moral, to deal with the consequences of this tragedy.
This horrifying act of terror has resulted in a massive ecological and humanitarian catastrophe. Dozens of settlements have been already flooded by water. The Ukrainian government has organized the evacuation from the territory of Kherson Oblast under our control. However, on the left bank, in the temporarily occupied area, people have been abandoned by the Russians. 10 settlements have been flooded there, and hundreds of homes have vanished beneath the water. People who stayed there are forced to leave their homes on their own, while those unable to do so find themselves trapped in the face of this disaster. The Russian occupiers don't even make an effort to help these people. They have left them to perish. International humanitarian organizations, on behalf of the government of Ukraine, I urge you, you must act immediately. We appeal to you to take charge of evacuating people from the territories of Kherson Oblast occupied by Russia. We must save the lives of these people whom the occupiers have condemned to death. We must act now.
The disaster occurred on the territory of Ukraine, but its consequences will have a negative impact on many countries, so it is a common problem. Pollution of the Black Sea, climate change, food security, etc. For us, the first priority is to save people from the disaster zone. They are placed in a safe place with great living conditions, but restoration of the blown dam may take up to several years and will require enormous resources, in particular financial. It is impossible to fully engage in rescue and restoration work in the conditions of Russian occupation in the south of Ukraine. It is necessary to put pressure on Moscow to withdraw its troops. The Russian terrorist attack on the Kakhovka HPP should be condemned publicly and by international courts. Already now, additional sanctions should be imposed on the terrorist state. Subsequently, the Russian Federation must financially compensate for all the damages it has caused. Russia once again confirmed its absolute indifference to the civilian population it occupied, which is contrary to the Geneva Convention. In particular, the Russians did not evacuate the residents of the left bank of the Kherson region after the plot began. Moreover, a few hours after the explosion, Salda, the so-called head of occupational administration of the Kherson region, stood and said that there was nothing to worry about, when behind him the square in front of the cultural center in Nova Kakhovka was already flooded with water. Maybe the Russians have nothing to worry about, but we Ukrainians and all the people of the world who have a heart have something to worry about. Since 2014, the Russian regime has been trying hard to promote the version that Ukraine was a so-called failed state. However, the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation in February 2022 showed that Ukraine turned out to be a completely accomplished state in every sense. Our country withstood external aggression. The government did not run away. The people united to fight back. Why, after 15 months of war, we are ready to help our fellow citizens again and again. And the example of the south of Ukraine, which is now suffering after the Russian terrorist attack, once again confirms this. Now hundreds, if not thousands of volunteers have gone to the disaster zone to help people. We just went because someone else's grief always hurts us. But Russia, with its terrorist regime, is now the most suitable for this definition of a failed state. Nobody cares about the civilian population. In the occupied territories, people are simply drowning. While fires are raging over vast territories, money is allocated for the manufacture of missiles. And in Russia there is total and all-consuming corruption. Even now Russian oppositionists say that the military budget is being stolen and that more military equipment, missiles could be manufactured or payments to occupying soldiers could be increased. Yes, this is what the opposition says, which seems to be against the war, but in fact is against Putin, and the war could have been better waged. In the Russian failed state, there is a complete inefficiency of the bureaucratic administrative apparatus of the state. Officials do not fulfill their direct duties. They do what they say in the Kremlin, and if they are silent in Moscow, then the local authorities do not know what to do. And there are no democratic institutions in Russia too. Human rights, environmental and journalistic organizations have become foreign agents. After all, they show what is actually happening, and the central government does not like it. Or look at the failed state parliament. It is fully controlled by the central government and makes decisions that are dictated from the high officers. All laws unanimously, the majority without discussion, and this despite the fact that in Russia there are two chambers of concerned deputies. The Russian government has already lost its monopoly on the use of force. There are armed formations in the country, private armies, military companies that are no longer controlled by the central government, and the civil war has already begun in Belgorod region. After all, law enforcement officers in Russia are now busy arresting people who went to rallies and not fighting organized crime. The state practices political repression, mainly directed against political opposition, certain groups, segments of the population, or ethnic communities. Does anyone else know where the western border of Russia is now? After all, according to the documents, it is either along the Dnieper or along the border of the Donetsk region, or along the Crimea. After all, it turns out that the Kremlin does not control part of the territory, and this is another sign of a failed state. Someone can say that Kiev does not control part of territory of Ukraine, but it is true because it was occupied. But we know exactly which territory is Ukrainian and which is not. Everything is according to the 1991 state border. Does anyone in Russia know where its border is?
It is not yet obvious to everyone the obvious. But nevertheless, Russia right now is showing all the signs of a failed state. Territory 404, a rapidly degrading and dying entity, and then everything will only get worse. The primary signs are obvious. Russia has always sold itself as a large and powerful state of stability. It turned out that this is a mannequin state, stuffed with rotten straw, which is disintegrated right before our eyes, spreading an incredible stench around the world. Mikhailo Podolyak, advisor to the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, on Telegram.
Also, an undoubted and classic sign of a failed state in the modern world is the inability of the state to have any real partners and allies to maintain stable diplomatic relations with surrounding countries. And in Russia, it is supported only by those states that are actually very dependent on it. It has no real allies and partners. For example, one of the last votes in the UN, the Russians were supported only by the DPRK, also a classic failed state. Belarus is a pseudo-state headed by the self-proclaimed President Lukashenko. Syria is a state completely dependent on the Russian Federation, headed by dictator Assad, and Nicaragua. Another sign is that Russia does not recognize the norms of international law and at the same time contradicts itself. How can a state be recognized as a valid state? Yuri noted if in 1997 the Russian Federation confirms the inviolability of the borders of Ukraine, then prolongs this agreement. Putin repeatedly declares that there can be no question of revising the borders of Ukraine, and then annexes Crimea, Donbass, begins a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, trying to bite off some more territories. That is, even on several grounds, not on all of them, Russia can be safely attributed to a state that is failed. Putin's Russia did not take place as a state that hopes that arose with the collapse of the USSR did not come true, because the slave psychology of the majority of population and the ability to be vulnerably zombified. All this fundamentally buried the possibility of the Russian Federation to take place as a real state. If the Russian Federation falls apart over time, and it will fall apart, if Putin continues the policy of nuclear blackmail, if he risks using nuclear weapons, Russian citizens will have to bear for the policy of their failed state, such a responsibility that even the Germans could not dream of after the Nazi regime was destroyed. Today will be the summit with the participation of Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak in the White House. Before leaving the Washington, the Prime Minister announced U.S. business investments in the United Kingdom in the amount of $17 billion, although some of this amount has already been invested by U.S. companies in the British economy. Highlighting the strengths of the US-UK military alliance at the heart of NATO, Sunak said that the economic relationship between the two countries must also be engaged to protect Western democracy. At the same time, White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby expressed confidence that Ukraine would be the focus of Biden's talks with Sunak. The British Prime Minister has already guaranteed unlimited support for Ukraine after Kyiv accused Moscow of blowing up the dam of the Kakhovka HPP in order to prevent the counteroffensive of the armed forces of Ukraine. Of course, we are awaiting a decision on the F-16 fighters. Earlier, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky said that he had received a serious and powerful offer from the leaders of countries ready to supply F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine and was waiting for final agreements with key allies. Let me remind you that US President Joe Biden told G7 leaders in May that Washington supports joint programs which allies to train Ukrainian pilots to fly the F-16. However, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that no final decision has been made on the supply of aircraft by the United States. That concludes our today's video. Thank you for watching, stay updated and subscribe to our UATV English channel for more news from Ukraine. Your support really matters. Goodbye.